Right, welcome back everybody. So today, big day at the Supreme Court of Appeal in Bloemfontein. The question we're asking you, as an accused, should President Jacob Zuma have his day in court? What is your opinion regarding the fraud and corruption charges against President Jacob Zuma? Already the replies coming in fast and furiously. You can write to us at Morning Live SABC. We'll take a look at all of them. I'm just looking at some that are on my timeline. This is from Chris Twala saying the president should have a day in court because nobody is above the law. That will show the work of the law to everyone. Another one, Justin Colbert. We want to jail the man who steals a loaf of bread, but embrace the man who robs a nation. And then my last one for now, we'll read lots more to you as the broadcast goes on. Lesibana saying, yes, he is no different to any of us. He must have his day in court. All right, so at the heart of all of this, today, the Bloemfontein Supreme Court of Appeal will hear oral arguments between President Jacob Zuma's lawyers and the NPA on one side and the representatives of the DA on another. The fraud and corruption charges case against President Zuma has continued to haunt over the past 8 years since the then acting NPA head, Mokotedi Mpshe, dropped the charges. Now, you'll remember last year, the North Gauteng High Court's full bench found that the decision to drop the charges was irrational and President Zuma should face prosecution. Both the President and the NPA have appealed the judgment. To find out more, let's cross over to our reporter, Aldrin Sampear. He, of course, is just outside the Supreme Court of Appeal in Bloemfontein. Good to have you, Aldrin. Thanks so much for talking to us here on the program. So, I've sort of given a little bit of a synopsis of all of this, but we've got to bring the DA into all of this because the DA are now also appealing the appeal by the President and the NPA. Just talk to us about how something like this is actually going to work.
Well, certainly, remember that the DA has been at the heart of this challenge since that decision taken by Mokotedi Mpshe on the 1st of April back in 2009, and they've been fighting that decision ever since. I even remember, I was even speaking yesterday to the guys on Your World. I remember how Helen Zille walked out of the North Gauteng High Court with the so-called spy tapes in her hand, with an that was written, sealed, and keep sealed, and that's how important this case has been for the DA. And the DA, even as far back as when that argument was being heard in terms of getting access to the spy tapes as well as the actual transcripts and the audio, is that the DA was saying even back then that they are going to challenge this President Jacob Zuma's bid not to have his day in court and go all the way to the Constitutional Court, and that has been the matter ever since. And that they were successful in the North Gauteng High Court when the court handed down the judgment and said that President Jacob Zuma should face the charges as per the indictment back in 2009 before Mokotedi Mpshe decided to hand down, or rather Mokotedi Mpshe decided to drop the charges against President Jacob Zuma. And President Jacob Zuma is, of course, challenging that decision here at the Supreme Court, and the NPA is also challenging that decision. The basis of the NPA's decision, though, to challenge this matter is more an issue around the separation of powers. They argue that this court instruction essentially means that the court has decided on behalf of the NPA that President Jacob Zuma should be prosecuted. And in the application, in the dismissal of the appeal application, the North Gauteng High Court said that it did not instruct the prosecution of President Jacob Zuma, but merely said that he must face the charges in the indictment as per 2009. And the argument from the DA essentially says that as far back as 2009, when Downer, who was leading the prosecution against President Jacob Zuma at the time, indicated that it must be a court of law that decides whether the abuse of process, as alleged by Mokotedi Mpshe, was so severe that it tainted the prosecution against President Jacob Zuma. That decision was, or that instruction was ignored, and the North Gauteng High Court actually upheld that and said actually it must be a court of law that looks into the veracity around the abuse of process.
All right. Let's look at these corruption charges. Now, they relate to a major government arms deal arranged in the late 1990s. How much will the Cerreta arms report also impact on this case?
Well, not at this stage, because remember that at this stage you're only dealing with the decision or the rationality around Mokotedi Mpshe's decision to drop the corruption charges. So we're not dealing with the criminal intent or the corruption charges themselves, on the veracity of the corruption charges. So the Cerreta Commission's report will have no bearing whatsoever on this case. And we can just mention that the Cerreta Commission didn't find President Jacob Zuma of any wrongdoing, not even former President Thabo Mbeki. However, though, the Judge Squire report found the Judge Squire judgment, the judgment against Sampear, President Jacob Zuma's former financial advisor, found that there could have been a corrupt relationship, or found rather credence in the prosecution's argument at the time that there was a corrupt relationship between President Jacob Zuma and Sampear, and the monies that were paid over to President Jacob Zuma suit the definition of corruption as well as bribes.
Yeah. So at the heart of all of this, and it's important to get the wording right, because I think that the High Court in Pretoria ruled that the decision to drop the corruption charges against President Jacob Zuma in 2009 was irrational. That meant the decision to charge the president with corruption will be reinstated depending on what happens in the next 2 days at the SCA. Is that the right understanding?
It doesn't end here, and this matter is not anywhere closer to an end. Even if you look into the documents that have been filed by President Jacob Zuma's counsel, they argue that even if the NPA reinstate the charges against President Jacob Zuma, that would give rise for a permanent stay. An application to go to court, the President Jacob Zuma's counsel would go to court and argue that this is a mistrial, that President Jacob Zuma hasn't been treated fairly, and then in essence it would mean that the NPA would then have to oppose that application. And that's the quagmire that has been raised by President Jacob Zuma's counsel, that how would the NPA then argue in court that President Jacob Zuma should face the charges based on a court ruling, when the NPA itself has already said that it would be unfair and it would not be in the interest of justice of the accused to have him face these charges.
Yeah, this is a different scenario. I mean, when we're talking about the Supreme Court of Appeal, you're sitting in a court facing 5 judges, and these judges have a notorious reputation for being exceptionally hard and very difficult, and their questions are pretty tough as well. I mean, this is not going to be a walk in the park for either side, is it?
Well, certainly not, considering that normally with the Supreme Court of Appeal, only a day is set aside for arguments, and in this matter, 2 days have been set aside. So it just speaks to the importance of this case, and probably how long it would take for the justices to cross-examine and cross-question the various counsels that are party to this matter. But quite interestingly, though, is this matter is being heard here at the Supreme Court of Appeal, and a couple of months ago, we had President Jacob Zuma appointing Justice Mandisa, who is now the judge of the Supreme Court of Appeal. So this will be a major case for her, and many people will be looking quite closely at the type of questions that you ask, and also eventually the outcome of this court case.
Yeah, very, very close to home, isn't it? Something like this, have we seen this happening in our courts before, where we're actually seeing the NPA teaming up with the presidency, appealing against a decision? I mean, has something like this happened in our history?
Not that I know of. It is one of the strangest cases, one of the cases that have been dragging on, one of the longest cases that have been dragging on in the courts of law. I counted last night that matters relating to this case have at least been heard 4 times in this court. First, it was the application by the NPA, then challenging President Jacob Zuma, who then went to the High Court, arguing that the prosecution against him is politically motivated. Judge Chris Nicholson upheld that, and the NPA came to this court and argued that President Jacob Zuma actually should face those charges, and the Supreme Court of Appeal upheld that. And then there was the matter around the search and seizure of President Jacob Zuma's offices, as well as his flat in Killarney at the time. This court upheld that the search and seizures was constitutional. And then there's also a matter also relating to the search and seizure. And you remember this. We were here in this court a couple of years ago when this court was hearing a matter around Judge President John Hlophe, because remember that Judge President John Hlophe is accused, or was accused, as per the disciplinary trial, that he tried to influence the Constitutional Court Justices Bessen Kabinde and Chris Jafta on the outcome of the application at that time. And then as well you have Sabir Sheikh. Sabir Sheikh was in this court as well, trying to have the Judge Squire court case, or Judge Squire judgment also overturned in this court case, rather in this court, and that was unsuccessful.
All right, just finally, Aldrin, as we let you go, we saw a little bit earlier a gentleman behind you cleaning up those stairs, making them looking very pristine and clean. The President has always said that he wants his day in court. Do you think that's ever going to happen?
Oh, it's a difficult one to say whether indeed he will ever have his day in court. You know, if you look at political analysts are arguing that it would be really difficult to have a president. And even if you look at case law across the continent, it's very difficult to try a sitting president. And that also speaks to the issue around political will, whether there's political will to prosecute a sitting president. And probably after President Jacob Zuma has stepped down as president, probably in 2019, or if anything, if the rumors are anything to go by, probably next year after the December elective conference of the ANC, and there's a different president in the seat of the president, then probably then would we see President Jacob Zuma have his day in court. But that will only be if the courts of law find in favor of the DA and feel that President Jacob Zuma indeed should have his day in court. And as I've indicated, that President Jacob Zuma's counsel has already said that a decision to prosecute him would raise an application for a permanent stay, a mistrial. And this is definitely not the end of this court case. We'll be heading straight to the Constitutional Court, whatever the ruling outcome of this court case is.
All right, let's leave it there for now. Aldrin Sampear, we'll cross back to you. This is the big story of the day. We'll, of course, continue to monitor it constantly. What time is it expected to start, Aldrin?
We're supposed to start around about 9:30 towards 10 o'clock, and then probably end later this afternoon. But as I've indicated, tomorrow morning as well, there will be some arguments being heard. Excellent. Aldrin, thanks so much. We'll catch up with you again in the next hour here on Morning Live. He'll have a guest then. But for now, let's take a look at what